this is an independent struggle
against colonialism.
We're fighting against our imperium, our conquistadores. This is the same struggle we had when we fought against the Spanish Empire. The United States has in Honduras one of its most strongest control in the region, and it's not allowing us to exercise democracy or exercise our civil rights. This government doesn't exist. It's only the face of the United States military and economic intervention. You don't see Hernandez with any development project. You put a problem in front of Hernandez, you have to wait a month and it grows, because he is not the president of nothing. He's just a representation of the United States military interest in this country.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton with Max Blumenthal. We are in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. Also, another cool development, you can see we don't even have mics. We're actually using lav mics, which we should have been doing for a while.
Would have saved us some fights, on-camera fights.
Yeah, on-camera mic fights. But we have an excellent guest with us here. I'll let him introduce himself, but we are joined by Gerardo Torres. Do you want to explain who you are?
Oh, hi. Thank you for the invitation. I am Gerardo Torres. I am the international coordinator of the Libre Party that was created by the National Resistance Front that was initiated in 2009. And I'm also the coordinator of its Political Education Institute.
The Libre Party is a party that has sort of been created as the main resistance umbrella to everything that's happened in the last 10 years with the coup and the regime of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is this US-backed president who's facing widespread protests around the country over his corruption, over mass privatization schemes, and it is led by the person who was the democratically elected president of Honduras until 2009, Jose Manuel Zelaya. And you are at the center of creating this party and building it, and at the center of this national campaign. I guess many people who are watching, who are really well informed, still may not know what's going on in Honduras, because even with us here and we're pumping out our different stories, I can tell a lot of people aren't paying attention. They're paying attention to other things. The US media isn't doing much on what's happening here. So maybe we could start with the basics. Tell us about the work you're doing, but really what's happening in this country with the student protests, the doctor protests, and why they're protesting this government, which is backed up completely by the United States.
Well, the first thing that you have to know about Honduras is that this is one of the most obedient countries in the world of the United States orders. It has always been like this since our independence in 1821. Honduras really fast became a really strong ally of the United States. By 1890, we already had in Honduras the main mining companies of the United States installed here. And by 1930, we were known as the Banana Republic because we had Dole, Chiquita, Standard Fruit Company that had transformed all our valleys in the productions of bananas and other fruits by the United States corporation. It was well known that the real president of Honduras was the US ambassador instead of the Honduran president. And there's also important or interesting news that people from the United States said that it was cheaper to buy a mule than to buy a Honduran congressman. So that's like the history of Honduras. In the 1980s, when El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala had their liberation process and there were guerrillas all around the region, the United States had a strong control in Honduras, and we had a state of life for the middle class and for Tegucigalpa and the main cities, one of the biggest or the highest in Latin America. So people lived very well. Lempira was 1 by 1 with the dollar. All the people traveled to the United States. That was some money to keep people control while they were attacking the other countries. With that, they also created the biggest U.S. military base inland in Latin America. It's installed 80 kilometers from where we're right now, from Tegucigalpa. It's called Palmerola, and it's the headquarters of the South Command, that is the United States Army Military Forces Coordination for Latin America and the Southern region.
It's where they land all the big planes, and it's just a real center of influence.
It's really important. John Kelly, who was the chief of staff of Donald Trump, before he had that position, he was the coordinator of the South Command, and he lived here in Tegucigalpa. So he moved from Tegucigalpa to be chief of staff of the United States. Also, John Dimitri de Groponte, who was the ambassador of Honduras in the 1980s, is one of the United States' biggest consultants for war interventions. And so this is like a really important position for geopolitical, for strategy, for military control. From Honduras, the coup against Juan Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala took place in 1954. The invasion of Panama in 1991, all the attacks against Cuba, all the attacks against Salvador, Guatemala, the North Caribbean had been prepared, organized here in Honduras.
And the attacks on the Sandinistas in the 80s.
Yes. We had, in the 1980s, we had 4 armies in Honduras. We had the United States Army, we had the Honduran military forces, we had the Contra, that was the military forces that was organized by the Reagan's government against Revolution Sandinista in Nicaragua, and we had the Salvadorian army that had its base prepared here to fight against Farabundo Martí.
And then the right-wing group would be Arena, right? So there were Arena allied paramilitaries here.
Yeah, you had Tegucigalpa, for example. There's a hotel here that is currently the Clarion Hotel, but it used to be the Sheraton Hotel, where you could find Contras from El Salvador, military from Contra from Nicaragua, military from El Salvador, U.S. Marines. You can find people that were trained by the School of the Americas that live in Tegucigalpa and were prepared here. So this has always been a military United States safe zone.
It's like a death squad
Kind of
Burning Man.
Yeah, yeah.
A kind of neo-colony, really.
Yeah.
Well, not even just neo. You mentioned since the 1820s that this has been in the U.S. imperial sphere of influence. This is the time of the Monroe Doctrine. And we actually now see John Bolton, Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, who has repeatedly invoked the Monroe Doctrine. So do you think it's fair to say that Honduras has essentially been a U.S. colony since?
It is. Honduras gained its independence from Spain in 1821. Then we had like 10 years of independence with our maximum hero that is called Francisco Morazan. And then very quickly, by 1840, 1845, we were already discussing with the United States, how can we give them more? The logic of the Honduran government to the United States has always been, how can we give you more? How can we give you more military support, more money? And the United States knows that, so that's why they've been supporting 2 political parties. That's the Liberal Party and the National Party, with some historical interventions of military forces that have made dictatorships. But in the long run, the control of the United States has never been removed, except when Celaya got to power. So
yes, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
I do want to go back and talk about the Contra Wars in the 80s. It's another key moment in modern U.S. history where Honduras, as you said, was used as a base to train Contra forces fighting against the socialist governments in the region. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's talk about who Celaya is. This was the democratically elected president. And we are here in Honduras. You might wonder why we're here. We're here because a few days ago, last week, was the 10th anniversary of the US-backed military coup. So talk about the election of Celaya, this brief period of independence in the coup.
Well, Celaya got to power in 2006 with the Liberal Party. It was probably one of the lowest electoral participations in our history. Nobody cared, nobody had interested in democracy. We had a really enormous natural disaster in 1998, in October of 1998, that was called the Hurricane Mitch, that destroyed completely Honduras. So my generation, in 1999, we created a socialist group because we had time. We had Honduras was completely destroyed. All the people that were like the big defenders of capitalism and the United States. We passed a year after the destruction, very similar to what's going on right now in Puerto Rico, and our biggest allies weren't there for us. So we had time. There was no school. There was like this big disaster, and we declare ourselves like part of that new generation of socialists, and we started working in that sense. By 2000,
was there anyone you were inspired by at the time? This is at the beginning of the Chavista era
but
as well.
in that time we didn't believe Chavez was an ally.
Well, he didn't declare himself socialist yet.
Yeah, and he was a military.
Yeah.
And we have had really bad experience with military in Latin America. But because in the 1970s and 1960s, many of the military dictatorships began as progressive military. So we were like very careful with Chavez at that point. We only had Cuba at that moment. But what happened in that period of time was that many people started seeing different what we saw of the United States. So, and also we had the beginning of Las Maras. You had to go to
These were the narco gangs.
The Maras are gangs that were created by Central American migrants in the 1970s and 1980s, and then were expelled of the United States, taken out of jails and brought back here. So we had like that cultural impact for us, where we saw like these people that were really violent but they were in our barrios, in our neighborhoods. So they became our friends, and we started like getting to know them. The thing was that the government of Ricardo Maduro, who was the government from 2002 to 2006, had a no tolerance policy in which they started killing people from young people. It didn't matter if you were
suspected of being in a gang. It's like the mano duro.
La mano dura. It was called Cero Tolerancia.
And the Bush administration was pushing this policy on Latin America.
Yeah, and they had money for that. They had something that was called, that it was the beginning, and then it was called CARSI, that is the Central American Region Security Initiative, that the United States gave a lot of money to the police and to the military police. So you had to go to the government to ask for a permission to have a tattoo. Because it had to say the color of the tattoo, the dimension of the tattoo, and had to assure that you weren't a marero, even if you had tattoos. So we were like living in that. There was the beginning again of death squads that were killing young people, especially poor young people. There was policies against hip hop, rap, anything that our government understood as maras was prohibited.
So what happens if you got caught listening to hip hop?
You go to jail 72 hours.
For listening to rap?
If you had like a concert and then police said, this is a union of mareros, so you were sent in jail for 72 hours. So nobody cared about Celaya's election, really. Like it was like another...
I feel like Iggy Azalea should be thrown in jail, though.
Yeah.
Just...
yeah, but
some people should be jailed, but not all. Anyway.
But this is an important point, because what you're saying is that there was frustration with the two-party system, that every few years you mention that you have the right-wing party, the National Party, and then the Liberal Party, which is the kind of centrist party.
But it's also right-wing.
Yeah, the center-right and the right, and then they switch power every few years, like the U.S., like many other countries, and people didn't really engage in the democratic system.
But it's very interesting. Something that happened with Celaya is that if it wasn't for that situation, there was no way Celaya could be the candidate of the Liberal Party. There was no way.
Because this is the contradiction I wanted to unpack, because we did an interview at the Gray Zone with Manuel Celaya, and our colleague Anya Parampol was interviewing him, and one of the things that Anya said is, when you were elected, you were running as part of a center-left party, and then he corrected her and he said, no, it was a center-right party. Yeah. So the point is that because of the fact so few people cared about the democratic processes, and because no one really was paying attention, you had this figure who was actually who had different politics, who was able to make it through in that system. That's
Well,
really
the difference with Celaya, with all the before presidents, was that he really wanted the job and he wanted to be the president of Honduras. That was like the big problem for the United States with Celaya. He tells you the story that when he got to the presidency, the United States gave him the names of the people that should be in his government. And when he told them that he didn't want any intervention, so they gave him 3 names for each ministry, and they said, okay, you can pick one of these 3 names. That's like the biggest independence you're gonna have.
nice colonialism. But
So-
let you choose who you.
Multiple
Yeah,
choice
you
colonialism.
choose one of 3.
Multiple choice colonialism.
Yeah, you choose one of 3, and that's your independence. And he started like having a lot of friction with the United States Embassy. We still, in 2006, we were part of the left movement, and we fought against Celaya.
Inside the Liberal Party or
No,
outside?
we were not. We didn't want to have anything
Nothing
to do
with the Liberal
with the Liberal Party and National Party. We were something called Bloque Popular, who was an anti-neoliberal platform, and ourselves, this organization that we created in 1999 was called Los Necios. That means the stubborns. That is based on a Silvio Rodriguez song that's called El Necio. So a lot of necios are around politics in Honduras. The organization still exists, but many of us are not longer there. This year in November, it's 20 years since we created that. Wow. That I was 15 years old. That's what I mean. That's like that generation that created that. So we fought against Celaya. The Bloque Popular fought against Celaya. He threw us tear gas bombs. We threw him rocks, like we do today. The difference was that in 2017, in another paro nacional that we had, he called us to the presidential house, and he told us, what can we do to...
Wait, what year?
2007.
Seven.
Yeah, 2007.
2007 in the first year of his presidency.
Yeah, so 2006, we were fighting all year long against Celaya. 2007, I think it's January or February of that year, he called us to talk with us.
And geopolitical point on this, this is also the time when the pink tide is picking up, when you have Chavez declares himself a socialist, he goes to the UN and denounces the Bush administration. So did you feel at that time that there was a kind of left-wing upswell going on in the region?
Momentum.
We were winning at that time.
Lula in Brazil.
Yeah, it was like the highest point of the left progressive movements in Latin America that year.
When we were in Venezuela, we interviewed Diego Sequeira on another episode, and he said that 2007 was like the golden year of Chavismo.
In 2006, I witnessed Daniel Ortega's inauguration in Managua, and everyone was there. Evo was there, and Hugo Chavez comes out, and everybody comes to see him. And then they left when Daniel came on stage because he's not a very good speaker. But you could feel it in the air, and people in Nicaragua were saying it's been a long time since we had anything like this. So him calling you to the palace was a real turning point in this country.
Yeah, but at the same time, we were strong ourselves. In that year, we created something that was called La Coordinadora Nacional de Resistencia Popular, the National Coordinator of Resistance. Well, for the first time, we got together COPIN, that was Berta Cáceres.
Which is a major human rights group.
Yeah.
Indigenous.
The first indigenous anti-neoliberal movement in Latin America. Berta was then famous after her assassination, and we had like the Jesuits, we had the Garifunas, that is like the Afro descendants here in Honduras. Ourselves, that we were Bloque Popular. It was student movement, worker unions, teachers movement, and we had like this big platform that we were able to stop Honduras anytime we want. So even the left on Honduras was really strong. So Celaya called us to the presidential house. We talked to him, and he told us that he was thinking about Petrocaribe. That was the Chavez initiative to give, in solidarity, low-cost oil, gasoline to poor countries. We had, until that moment, an historical agreement with Shell, Esso, Texaco, and Chevron, where they had like the most profit for all importation of oil and lo que se deriva de.
So the agreement was that U.S. petroleum companies dominated oil imports in Honduras.
Yeah,
completely.
and Honduras bought oil to United States companies as we were a private company. So they charge us as we were like an individual buying for gasoline in our own country.
Yeah.
So Celaya said, this is it. We're going to buy oil as a country at lower prices and as loans. So Petrocaribe gave you like any amount of oil you needed, and you could pay it in 10 years. So Celaya's managed to drop the prices of gasoline to the lowest in the region, and that was one of his strong points, but also one of the big problems he had with the United States. He was really close to Chavez.
Yeah, and in our interview with Celaya, which you can find at The Gray Zone, thegrayzone.com, he said that this is one of the points when he started buying oil, I guess you could say buying, but receiving oil basically for very low prices, close to free, from Venezuela, from Petrocaribe. That's when the Bush administration sat him down and said, you have to stop doing this, you cannot work with Chavez. He told us in the interview that Negroponte, specifically John Negroponte, who was the Undersecretary of State for Bush, warned him that you cannot have any diplomatic relations with Chavez.
And then he said Bush himself. Bush. George
Yeah.
W. Bush.
And
you can't go there and put oil on your country.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
That was in the White House. That was the last time a Honduran president has entered the White House. Meet with the United States president. Because it's really interesting. Even though they did the coup and they have been really obedient with the United States, Celaya was the last president they treated as an equal. Yeah. And the other three administrations, they work for them. They work for the United States Embassy in Tegucigalpa.
Right.
So you can see like the difference. That was the last time that meeting with Celaya with George W. Bush was the last time a Honduran president has sat down with a United States president.
Well, it shows the colonial mentality. If you treat your underlings too well, they might get the wrong ideas, so you have to just ignore them.
Yeah. So after that, we started working with Celaya. We started seeing how the business, how the military, how the Congress, how the Supreme Court started to get away from him. And in 2008, he signed an ALBA. Right. That is like the biggest thing.
The major economic confederation with Venezuela, built around Venezuelan oil.
Well, ALBA was the counterpart of something that was called ALCA, that was like this big dream of the Chicago boys inside the George W. Bush government. They thought about a free market absolute area from Mexico to Argentina. The thing is that each agreement was the United States with Guatemala, the United States with El Salvador, the United States with Honduras. So it wasn't really a free trade area where we can also move our market. No, it was only the United States.
For the U.S.
It was the United States that could go through all Latin America with all their products without any tariff, without any payments, with putting their companies, what the price they wanted.
It's like a corporate reverse caravan.
Yeah. And Chavez got together with Lula, and in the meeting of
the president of Brazil,
in that time,
now a political prisoner, imprisoned by, I mean, we can't go into it, but by the current far-right government, Bolsonaro, that the U.S. helped install again. So again, we see how they...
So imagine this. In 1993, when Chavez did the attempt of coup d'etat and he failed, he was taken to prison, Lula was the president of the biggest union in Brazil. That was the workers that worked with metal and mining companies in Brazil. He was the president of that. And they created something with Fidel Castro that is called the Sao Paulo Forum. And the Sao Paulo Forum, El Foro de Sao Paulo, is currently the main platform of political progressive leftist parties in Latin America. So the Foro de Sao Paulo in 2007 was like the main orchestra director of all these efforts. So Chavez and Lula in 2003 had stopped the intention of ALCA in a meeting of the OAS in Argentina, in Mar del Plata. So they said, we don't want Alca. They knew that for sure. And Chavez, in a effort to change the word, he created ALBA. He still didn't knew exactly what it was going to be, but he knew that we didn't want the United States Free Trade Area that was called ALCA. It was called Área de Libre Comercio de las Américas. So Chavez created ALBA, that means dawn. Alianza Alternativa Bolivariana para las Américas, the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas. And it was really interesting because the price of things wasn't the same as the market. Things had the same price. So if I gave you milk and you give me oil, it costs the same. It was the cost of the impact for the country. So you gave me technology and I gave you milk, or I gave you food, I gave you rice or corn or beans. And the products were counted as how people were going to receive it. So what happened in Honduras right now? We produce coffee, bananas, and palm oil. So we can buy oil. We have to produce a lot because it costs so much less than oil. So we have to work a lot more. We have to put a lot more people in production. We have to do a more effort to buy something that you just have to open a something so you can get a barrel of oil. So Chavez understood, and Lula understood markets in another way. It's like, you have products that I want, like the basic idea of market. I have products that you want. I'm not going to strangle you with my prices. We're going to put them at the same level, and we're going to create this cooperation. And Celaya is something that I don't know if he told you, that was like the biggest moment that year and a half for the Honduran local business, because we were getting things that we had never got with the United States. We had the capacity to buy more things with our corn, with our coffee, with our bananas, with our watermelons, with our shrimp, with our fish. We could buy things that help our industry develop, because to buy iron or to buy any other metal is really expensive for us.
Basically buying the infrastructure to renovate business.
Yeah. Well, and this is also the idea of ALBA and the institutions that not just Chavez and Lula, but other leaders were trying to create. You had the rise of the BRIC system. So they were creating alternative economic institutions, financial institutions, so they can help each other develop their countries in the global south, whereas U.S. corporations are not interested in developing Honduras, they're not interested in developing Brazil, they only want to make profit, whereas you had these institutions like ALBA where they said, the goal is not just to make money, the goal is that I'm going to help Brazil develop and you're going to help Honduras develop.
So this was all the background to the coup.
Yeah,
development independent of the U.S. is a giant threat. This is 2008, the best year this country had independently. And what happened next?
Well, what happened next was that the United States wasn't willing to allow it. So they started working with their historical allies. They took people from the Libre Party, people from the National Party. They offered money. They got to the military forces. They offered money. And they had this really strong campaign that is only compared, obviously, inside Honduras as Venezuela has it internationally. It was there were 400,000 lies in each news. In each newspaper, it was Celaya was destroying the environment. Celaya was taking people. The people are going to be poor. The communists were going to take the people's houses. The communists. It was
Iran and Hezbollah are coming.
Yeah. All the anti-communist propaganda of the Cold War brought back in 2009
through corporate right-wing media.
Yeah.
And talk about the media here, because it's controlled by, many places in Latin America and a lot of the world, it's controlled by a small handful of families.
Well, it's there are 3 families that control all the mass media here in Honduras. They're part of something that's called La Secretaría Interamericana de Prensa, That's SIP, that is controlled in Miami, that controls all the main local media of Latin America, and is controlled by the right-wing groups in Miami. They, we also have CNN, Telemundo, Univision, that are like the same thing, telling lies every day. It's really interesting because the coup in Honduras takes place in June of 2009, and Telesur of Venezuela was just created, like a couple months before. So the first thing that Telesur does abroad, the first international coverage that they do, is the coup. So it was like the perfect timing, and that's why Telesur is so strong here in Honduras. It was the only international media that was telling you what you saw on the streets. So what happened during the coup?
Well, and really quickly, for viewers who don't know, Telesur was a very important initiative because it wasn't, it was spearheaded by Venezuela and Chavez, but it was also funded and supported by the other progressive Latin American countries. It was a pan-Latin American news outlet that was, the attempt was to provide this information to people that they're not getting because, like you mentioned, there already is this consortium of right-wing media based in Miami, and they're already controlling the narratives across Latin America. So the idea was to make something counter-hegemonic against
and it was like the voice of ALBA. Telesur was the voice of that initiative, where not only left countries were invited. Chavez had this vision where all Latin American countries should be part of ALBA, and it's really it's a really good thing to say that Chavez never had that behavior that we see in the right wing, where if you're not part of them, then you're out. For example, when Macri got to Argentina and won the presidency in 2015, the first thing he did was to take out the Telesur from Argentina. Right. So Chavez had like that really important vision. Celaya, in that moment when he received the coup, he was really close to Chavez, he was really close to Fidel Castro, he was really close to Evo, Lula, Correa. And I think that at that moment of his life, he still wasn't a leftist leader. He still was thinking in Honduras as the capacity to govern Honduras, to bring things to the people. It was the coup that threw Celaya to the left. Chavez didn't ask Celaya to become a socialist for Honduras being part of ALBA. Chavez gave him because Celaya asked for it, and he invited him, and we became part of ALBA.
Well, in our interview, he confirmed that. Celaya said that Chavez never reached out to him because Chavez never thought of it, because Honduras had been, like you said, a U.S. colony with right-wing governments, and it was Celaya who reached out to Chavez, and that the corporate media, the right-wing media, had been using this as a myth, saying, oh, Celaya is a puppet of Chavez, when it was actually the opposite.
When they gave him the coup, then it was something interesting because there's a pupuseria, pupusas, for you don't know, they haven't been here, or you have any Salvadorian near you.
America,
it's a typical food from El Salvador and Honduras. And in front of the presidential house, there was this famous pupuseria where they sell typical or like street food. And we had a meeting there on the day of the coup. It was June 28, 2009. And it was the first time we sat together people from the Bloque Popular, that we were part of, this left social movement, political groups, people from the Libre Party, and people that had never paid interest in politics. During Celaya's government, our relationships with the Liberal Party were not necessarily the best, because we were very different from them, and they weren't part of the government. But in that day, we were like together, these three groups, and we decided to create El Frente Nacional contra el Golpe de Estado, the National Front against the coup d'etat. And we started working with the Liberal Party for the first time, and we were like this radical left wing.
We can't work with them in the U.S. really that well, and they call themselves the Resistance, but they want to like bomb shit.
Yeah,
They won a Cold War, so
Well, that's their idea of resistance.
they're
It's different in the
yeah,
empire.
they're very different.
they loved it. Your resistance didn't like the CIA as much as ours did.
Yeah.
So you didn't have
Wait,
former.
you all didn't think that the FBI and the CIA were your allies? No, I mean.
Anyway, we're just joking around.
But
So,
you know that people from that Liberal Party said things that I really couldn't believe when I heard them. They said that we should ask the United Nations to bring the blue helmets to liberate Honduras.
oh, nice. Just like they did in Haiti.
Yeah, that's their way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
That's all what it was at that time. But we had things really important. Like a month after the coup, we created the National Front, the National Resistance Front, Frente Nacional de Resistencia Popular, and it's the first time, and we don't have it any longer, where we had at the same table the feminist movement with the evangelical church. We had the union workers with the LGBTQ community. We had students with campesinos. We were all sitting at this big table in the Union of Workers of the Coca-Cola and Pepsi. That is one of the biggest unions here in Honduras. And we took that as our headquarters, and we had meetings every day, and we were the resistance at that time. And we had liberals, people from the National Party, people from the former Communist Party of Honduras all together. And it was a really interesting moment because it was the first time when the Honduran people weren't agreeing with an order of the United States. And what they said at the time was that we wouldn't be able to be in the streets for a month. People were going to get tired and people were going to try to go to their houses, or Celaya was going to betray us. Something that they still say today. Celaya is going to betray you, Celaya is going to sign with Hernandez. We have passed 10 years, a complete decade, and they are continuing saying the same things they said about Celaya in 2009. What we had for these 10 years, well, we had really bad things like all the people that have been murdered and tortured and all the things that have gone on in Honduras. But we also, the United States with that coup in 2009, without knowing, created the first strong leftist political movement in the history of this country. We had strikes before, we had some political movements, but they were really small. What they created was a leftist political party that is Libre, that, as you said at the beginning, is the umbrella of all this struggle, that has the capacity to take power from them. And they know that. That's why in the last two elections, even though we have won the elections in 2013 and 2017, the United States and the Honduran military forces haven't let us get to power. It's like we won the election, but we're not in the government.
Talk about how the elections were stolen.
Well, you have all kinds of frauds. We have a really, really old electoral process. You go, you vote, they put some ink in your finger, in your huella dactilar, but you can take it away and you can vote again.
Right.
Yeah, our census has...
Unlike Venezuela's very advanced system.
Yeah, Venezuela, for example, you just vote and that's it. You have it's like a minute vote. And now you have, in Honduras, you have like the thing and then you take it off and then you go and vote again. We did an investigation in 2017 and we saw that more than 300,000 people that were already dead were still in the registration list.
They were chopping the fingers off of corpses.
No, you just presented the ID card, and it was like, you had like an ID card. It said you were 75 years old. It was like, yeah, sure, yeah, there's your vote. So 300,000 votes, maybe not sounding a big thing in the United States, but
only 9 million people
a
here.
country of 8 million people where 1 million lives in the United States and 200,000 people live in Spain and all around. And the majority of the people of Honduras are underage 18. Yeah. So 300,000 people can change an election. So that's one of the things they do. But that was enough.
It was such an obvious theft in 2017.
But the thing is that they did the thing of the dead people in 2013.
Talk about 2017 when the power went out.
So in 2017, we knew that. We knew that they were going to do the fraud, they're going to buy people, that they were trying to vote twice. So we created something that's called Los Comandos Antifraude, or the anti-fraud commands, that were people in the neighborhoods where we prepared them, organized them, and they were like with these chalecos. And that was like the first time we saw an organized security movement of the people of Honduras. And you could see the military forces really, really worried about, because you had thousands of people in los barrios, in the most poor neighborhoods, identified as Comandos Antifraude. And we had the control of the ballot, so people couldn't vote 2 times. And we couldn't get inside the voting space, but we didn't let people that had already voted, or people of the National Party, of the government, to go inside. And so we had that control. The thing is that we had so much difference of votes that even the things that they stole, the things that the fraud they had, they were forced to declare in the night of that election that with 80% of the votes already counted, we were winning by 6 points.
And by we, you mean Salvador Nasrallah, who's a very popular TV personality who was sort of not like Zelaya, but he was kind of part of the coalition.
We created something that was called the Opposition Alliance. The Libre Party, even though we were the biggest political force, we supported Nasrallah, Salvador Nasrallah, as the candidate. As you said, he's like the most famous TV personality in Honduras.
And very different from the Nasrallah our viewers probably know of. The Lebanese Hezbollah leader, very different.
No, nothing. At that time I worked, in 2000.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the evidence that the right-wing Esqualitos in Miami use as proof that Hezbollah has infiltrated the region.
In 2013, I was working with Press TV and Hispan TV as their correspondent here.
Which is Iranian media.
The Iranian media. And they were like in that time, Libre faced Hernandez, who's the current head of the regime in Honduras, and Nasrallah. It was his first election participation. And the people in Press TV told me, "Are you sure his last name is Nasrallah?"
But there's an Arab population.
Yeah, there's no connection, and he's not interested in.
So anyway, you had this wide margin.
Yeah.
It looked like a clear victory.
Yeah.
With 80% of the votes
Even
counted.
with some fraud thrown in there, they couldn't overcome the margin of victory at 80%. And then what happens?
We knew that they had the capacity to inflate their votes in 6-7%. So that means that we were really winning them by 14-15 points. Yeah. And with their fraud, they were at 6, but they couldn't get any higher. So the thing was that they threw down the system 468 times.
So they just kept shutting it down.
It came down. It just turned off 468 times. And that is in the report of the OAS. The OAS, Almagro, who everybody knows what Almagro is.
Luis Almagro, who's kind of like...
He's the head of the OAS, and he's
like a right-wing regime change lobby. I mean, he's pushing really hard against all of the left-wing governments in the region.
But even Almagro had to say that the Honduran elections were the dirtiest he had ever seen in Latin America.
They just couldn't ignore it. It was just so blatant.
And we're talking about things we have seen in Mexico, things we've seen in Haiti, things we've seen in the Dominican Republic.
Luckily, he didn't compare it to our 2000 elections, but the dirtiest in Latin America.
Yeah, he said, this is the dirtiest thing I have ever seen. 468 times the system went down. And when it finally broke, it was 48 hours without system. And when it came back, Hernandez was winning by 5 points.
Amazing.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, so we went to the
There
street.
were some swing districts that had been uncounted, according
You know, well,
to Chuck
what they
Todd.
said, the swing districts in Espanol is called los votos rurales.
Okay.
Or
The
the rural votes.
The
votes.
rural vote.
Yeah, so the rural vote,
It's
like people started multiplying themselves in the rural areas and
Yeah.
voted
We didn't-
massively.
They were hiding in the corn. We didn't know they
Yeah,
were there.
we didn't see them. We didn't see them, and they were all like pro-regime. And it was incredible. We had like the international community against them. We had people in the street. We were fighting really strong. And then the United States Embassy, through their business representation that's called Heidi Fulton, appeared on TV and said, the State Department and the United States government believe that Mr. Hernandez is the correct president of Honduras.
What a coincidence.
And we were like, but the problem is that Nasrallah, who was our candidate and was also from a right-wing tradition in politics, he went out to TV and said, well, if the United States is the winner, then that's it.
It's kind of like Al Gore.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
2000.
Exactly. Didn't even fight.
With so many shared values.
Yeah. and that was it.
Liberals in America and liberals in Honduras.
Yeah, so
that was it.
Maybe the problem is liberalism.
And what was, but you know, you were in the streets then, I mean.
We never stopped being in the streets. The comandos antifraude, the anti-fraud commands, transformed in something that's called los comandos insurreccionales. It's the insurrection or revolution commands. The difference from the 1970s and 1980s is that these are not clandestine organizations. Yeah. Los comandos insurreccionales are well known by all the neighborhood, by all the communities, and people. That is something really interesting that happened in here in Honduras. Is that people, if you ask them in the microphone, are you trying to conspire? Are you trying to take down this government? Gonna tell you, yes. We're working really hard to do it.
They just say it openly.
Yeah, it's not a secret. Yeah. We are working to bring down this government, and we haven't stopped working in this last year and a half.
We are going to end part 1 of our interview on Honduras here. Definitely be sure to check out part 2, and we're going to continue our discussion here with Gerardo Torres, and we're going to be talking about the impact 10 years after the US-backed right-wing military coup. You can support us at Moderate Rebels by going to patreon.com/moderaterebels. Thanks for listening.